Ready to start designing your own book cover but feel a little bit shaky when it comes to process and best practices? Stick around and I'm going to outline the basic process that I use every time I design a new cover for one of my low content books. For the best low content publishing advice with a focus on quality over quantity, subscribe to my channel and don't forget to hit that bell so that you can be notified every time I put out one of these videos, which is every Monday. All right, now I just want to start off by mentioning that even though you absolutely do not have to be a professional designer to create a beautiful, professional looking book cover for your low content books, you do have to have some aptitude for design. You do have to have some basic sense of what looks good and visually appealing, and you have to be willing to learn, and you really do have to enjoy the design process. If none of that sounds like you, then I really recommend outsourcing because, as I've said before, your book cover is the first impression that it's going to give to the potential customer. And if it fails at that stage of the game, the customer is just going to move on. They're not even going to get to your description page. They're not going to look inside, none of it. So your book cover really, really does have to shine. And again, you don't have to be a professional, but you do have to have some basic skill or inclination toward it in order to be able to create something that's really visually appealing and that's going to work for you. Now, the first thing I really want you to do is to get to know your target market. You've got to know exactly who you're trying to appeal for here because there's going to be some very different visual styles that are going to work for very different target markets. So something that you're designing for, let's say, a teenage girl is probably going to look vastly different than something that you're going to design for something for, maybe just a young woman that's even just 5 to 10 years older. So even though there's not a huge age difference there, let's say that young woman is in a corporate job or something, looking for something more professional, obviously that's going to look a lot different than something marketed towards a 15-year-old girl. So you've really got to know exactly who your target market is before you can start designing for them, because that's really what you want to keep in mind here. You are designing this cover for a particular person. So you've got to keep that end person in mind. So the second thing that you need to do is to get inspired. So the more beautiful design and cover art that you look at, the more that's just going to collect inside your memory banks and form a nice picture of what's actually trending right now, what's popular, what isn't. And this really ties back to that first step, which is getting to know your audience. If you start looking at inspiration online in some of the places that your target market hangs out, like maybe Pinterest or some blogs, or you can head right back to Amazon and see what's popular and trending there as well. That's also going to really help you get a sense of what your target market specifically is interested in. And of course, like I said, the more and more of this type of design that you consume, it's just going to act as inspiration for you, and it's going to get your own creative juices flowing. So I always recommend looking at as much of this stuff as you can. Now, one thing here, obviously, to remember is don't copy. Inspiration is completely different than copying someone. It's okay to, find a book cover and you really like, say, its whimsical design. Maybe they've used a floral motif, so you want to bring that, into a design that you're doing. That's fine. What you don't want to do, obviously, is just take an exact copy or even something that's not an exact copy, but something that's just been heavily borrowed from. You don't want to do that. It's copyright infringement, and it's just, it's not a best practice. People put a lot of time and effort into their design work, so you definitely should do the same. And you're not doing that by copying someone else. So get inspired, but don't copy. Now, the third thing I like to do is to create thumbnails. Now, I'm not talking about little images that you might see on someone's YouTube channel. I know that when we say the word thumbnail now, that's usually what people are talking about. But what I'm talking about goes back to, all of my design schooling years ago. When we were to create any type of design, we would always start by doing little tiny, maybe 1 or 2 inch sketches on a sheet of paper. And what that allows you to do is, first off, get a little bit more creative. There's just something about having that pencil in your hand that for me anyways, and I think for a lot of us, just gets those creative juices flowing a little bit better. But what it's also helping you to do is make very quick layout options for a book cover. So, in this case, we are talking about a book cover. So I might do 5 or 10 little rectangles and think about what are the elements that I want to see on that book cover. So it might be a main image, a title, a subtitle, and then I'll just do a tiny little sketch of what that might look like. And I will just quickly try out maybe 5 or 10 different layout options. And that just helps me get a sense of what my options are, where certain elements on that cover might sit. And it's just a lot quicker way of doing it than if I was to just create 10 versions on my computer screen. I can just get it done really quickly, play around with design hierarchy. So when I'm talking about hierarchy, what I'm talking about is what is going to be the one element that stands out first on your page. And then, whatever that element is, all of the other elements should sit back slightly from that. So if you've got a book where you've got a really catchy phrase and you want that to be the main element, then you'd want to make that bigger, and any supporting imagery that you use, you would probably want to make either smaller or in a softer tone so that it sits back. So that's basically what I'm talking about when I'm talking about design hierarchy. And that's something that you can play around with by doing these thumbnails. Once I've completed my thumbnails and I've got a pretty good idea of where I want all of the different elements to sit on that page, then I'm going to open up my design program. So at this point, it's important that you're using appropriate software. You can check out this video that I just did, I think maybe last week, where I talked about the different design software options that you have. It's best to use a dedicated desktop publishing design program if possible. If that's not possible, or if you're just more comfortable in a different program, that's totally fine as well. Just use whatever you're most comfortable with. Now, most likely for your book cover, you're going to need either 1, 2, or 3 of the following options. You're going to need a photo editor or a vector editing program or a desktop publishing program. So again, if you're unsure of which programs those might be, you can check out the video I did about what is the best software for your low content publishing. Now, next for your imagery, you're going to, of course, want to use very high quality imagery that you download from an appropriate stock site, or preferably, if you've got your own artwork, that is even better. Now, if like most of us, you're not sitting there creating your own artwork for each cover, that's totally fine, but make sure that you are getting it from a reputable site. And whatever image you use, be very, very sure that you have read and understood and adhere to 100% the license that comes along with that image. Now, if you're using free imagery and you're unsure of how to attribute proper images properly, then you can check out this video here where I talk about exactly that. Now, also remember, when you're using photographic imagery, you've got to use images that are 300 dpi. Anything less than that, and you run the risk of having a pixelated image print off in the final piece. So 300 is going to be the minimum that you want. And keep in mind that it needs to be 300 at the size you're using it at. So if you've got maybe an image that's about an inch or two high and you want to put that on, say, an 8x10 cover, and it's 300 dpi at 2 inches, once you blow that up, you're going to be losing resolution. So it's got to be 300 dpi at the size that you want to use it. It's totally fine to scale it down. I would just recommend not scaling it up. Now, vector images, on the other hand, they are not made with pixels, so they're scalable. It doesn't matter what size they are, you can just scale them up, down, it really doesn't matter. So if you're unsure of where to get high quality images, personally over the last few years, I've been using Deposit Photos, and then quite recently, I've been using Creative Fabrica, which I really, really love. They, in my opinion, have the best licensing options for what we're doing here, creating low content books. So you can check out my video here on the review I did for them a couple of weeks ago, I think, and you can check that out. The next thing to do is to be thoughtful with your font choices. Now, choosing fonts can be really, really tricky if you're not a professional designer. So I think this is where non-designers are probably going to struggle with the most, but it is still doable. So when in doubt, I would really recommend using classic, time-honored fonts. So if you're not sure of what those might be, you can just do a quick Google of classic fonts and you'll get a nice list of, the old standbys. There's so many of them out there that are just high quality, time-tested fonts that you really can't go wrong with. So I'd spend some time searching those out and getting to know exactly which fonts they are, just so you've got a nice little library of something you can come back to and feel assured that you're using a high-quality font. Now, again, think exactly about who you're trying to target here. You don't want a font that's going to look really, really traditional if, again, you're targeting someone that's a little bit younger, and, vice versa. If you're targeting a professional, you might want to do something a little bit more modern and streamlined, or maybe something a little bit more traditional. I mean, it just depends. But again, think about who that target customer is that you're trying to target and market to, and think about what might appeal to them. Now, one of the trickiest parts about working with fonts is combining them in ways that actually look good. So there are a few rules of thumb to keep in mind when combining fonts. And firstly, again, you can just look up classic font pairings and take a look at, again, some of the classic fonts that I was talking about a second ago, and you can see which ones look good together and why. So there's lots of resources on the web out there. And it's a good idea to just spend a little bit of time taking a look, just so you can kind of get a sense for what looks good. But as I just mentioned, there are a few general rules of thumb that you can keep in mind when combining fonts. So the first one is combine serif fonts with a sans serif font. Now this kind of falls under a larger umbrella rule of thumb here, which is to choose fonts that contrast each other well. And one of the ways that you can do that is by contrasting a sans serif with a serif font. Another way that you can use contrast is by using a lightweight font with a heavier or bold weight font. So it's important to try and have good contrast between those two fonts. If you don't, and the fonts look a little bit too similar and there's not enough contrast, you're going to create something that looks disharmonious. The eye is going to see them both, and they're going to see that they look similar, but they're not quite the same. So they just create a little bit of tension between one another, and it makes for a less appealing combination. Now, if you think font pairing is just a little bit too tricky altogether, then you can go ahead and just stick to fonts that are within the same family. Now, obviously, a family of fonts comes in all sorts of different weights. There's italic version, bold, there might be all caps, but all the fonts within a family are meant to work together. So if you want to choose a couple of different fonts, but you're a little bit unsure about what the best way to pair them with, or the best font to pair them with is, then you can just choose two fonts from within the same family, and generally they will tend to work together. But even when you're working within a font family, try and keep that contrast in mind. For example, you might not want to use a regular weighted font with a medium weighted font in the same family. Even though they're in the same family and, technically they do work together, there's not really enough contrast there to create anything interesting. So if you wanted to use, let's say, a bold with a lighter version of the font, or regular in the same family, that might be a little bit more of a better choice. Now, the last thing I'm going to leave you with the fonts, with the pairing of the fonts, is to consider visual hierarchy, which we already talked about when I was talking to you about general design and how I do my thumbnails. But you want to think about what you want the viewer to see first on the page. So that's probably going to be your main title. And then if you've got a subtitle, you're going to want that to sit back from the main title. You want someone to read the title first and the subtitle afterward. So in order to do that, you're going to want to make the subtitle a smaller size, or you might want to make it a lighter weight. So just think about that hierarchy. What do you want the person to see first? And then choose your font styling accordingly, whether that's, like I said, making that subtitle a lighter weight or bringing it down in size. Just think about that hierarchy and how you can differentiate the two and keep them separate, so that a person is reading the main element first and then the secondary element second. Now, I mentioned Canva already, but I'll mention them quickly again here. They've got thousands and thousands of great fonts, so that is a wonderful resource where you can get fonts at a very reasonable price. Now, the final tip I'm going to leave you with here is to print your cover at home if possible. I know not everybody has a printer at home, but if you do, it's really important to print that out first so that you can actually get a real sense of what that cover is going to look like in its final form, which is, the printed page. It's really hard when you're designing on screen to get a really accurate sense of how big typography is, or how an image is going to print. So there's going to be quite a big discrepancy between what you see on the screen versus what actually comes out of the printer on the other end. Now, I know your printer at home is going to be a lot different than what Amazon is going to be printing on, and that's fine, but basically what you're looking for here is just to make sure that the size of your typography works properly, it's not too big or too small, and that your image prints properly. So if you can, print it at the correct size, obviously. Most home printers should be able to accommodate up to an 8.5 by 11, so you shouldn't really have any issues there. Just print it off at the size you intend for it to be printed, and make sure there's no glaring errors. Make sure the type is the size that you want it, and that the image is printed out the way that you want it. So now you know the basic design fundamentals that are going to help you to create visually appealing, professional-looking covers for your low-content books. But what about the rest of the process? If you're just starting out and you need some more information on how to get going with this whole low-content publishing thing, be sure to download my guide, 3 Steps to Publishing Your First Low-Content Book in Less Than a Day, by clicking on the link in the description below. Also, if you'd like to join a like-minded community of fellow low-content publishers who are all on the same journey toward generating passive income, then you can join my free Facebook group, and again, that link is also in the description below. Check out these videos next for some more low-content book and design-related tutorials, and if you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button, be sure to subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Thanks for watching.